Hello, and welcome back to our study, Pillars of Creation, Life According to Genesis 1 through 2. And today we are going to look at the very beginning of the second creation story in Genesis 2, 4 through 7. But we also want to take a moment to we'll start by previewing the whole chapter of chapter 2, because we want to use that idea, kind of giving a look at the tone to take on the subject of the authorship of Genesis. Before we do either one of those, let's do a quick review of last week's lesson, which was over day 7 of the creation story in Genesis 1 through 3. So, somebody tell us what we said about God's work and God's rest, or what was meaningful to you about those two concepts.
My favorite part was just recognizing that God resting and in his abundance, he's still working because he's sharing with us. So it's not like he's sleeping, but that it's in this ongoing perpetuation of growth and passing on and um, co-dominion that it's it points to give us hope and recognition of our salvation, which should allow us to have a lot of security and also recognize that we can't earn what God's already given to us.
Yeah, yeah, what a great insight. I mean, I think sometimes we think of the free gift of grace that God provides, that I don't have to work for everything that I'm given in terms of my salvation and God's blessing is a New Testament concept. But here it is, right in the opening of the creation story, right in the opening of the Old Testament. Just this idea of this great grace given to us, and how this is a characteristic of God and God's character, God's nature, rather than and just an event that happens in the New Testament. Yeah, that reflection and the beauty there. I love the way you said that. Yeah, that's neat. What else? Other thoughts?
I love the way you paired Psalm 132 and just kind of paralleled the rest and the dwelling with. That this is a story about God dwelling with his people. So
Yeah, that is so a psalm of uh, reflection on God in the temple. And what does God do in the temple? God dwells there, God reigns there in power and in authority, but God rests there because God's authority is secure. God has sat down on the throne of the universe to reign in peace and security. And that is reflected both in the that Psalm 132, and definitely in sort of this poetic closing to the first creation story, that when God rests, it's not, God is not tired out from labor, but rather is enjoying the completion of God's workmanship, God's masterpiece, and is able to reign then going forward. And so that day 7 sort of reign of God. Yeah, yeah, great.
Along with that, there's also the picture in that psalm of what's being asked for, pleaded for food, for position, or to be with God and to be taken care of. And in the end, you have God saying, I'm giving these things. And it's food, it's a robe, it's all the things that you would picture a dwelling place. It's all the things that you would picture a king having, uh, the salvation and the joy. Um, but the salvation to me points to his power. And so all of these things that you would picture a king wrapped in, um, and having, he's giving.
Yeah. The blessing that
Yeah.
overflows is
Yeah.
provision and bread, salvation and joy. We looked at those
Yeah.
parallels in 132. And yeah, and that is all reflective of the creation story, right? God blesses. This is the activity that God does when God finishes creating mankind. God blesses mankind. And then there's that idea of when we, who are to image God, to co-reign with God, to imitate God's ways and God's good life, when we get to rest, part of our rest should be blessing. And that is, um, the blessing that we bless the Lord in praise, the blessing that we bestow on each other, the blessing on the earth and the animals, that we talked about in the previous lesson, right? So it kind of all comes together. Yeah. What else? Any other thoughts about last week? 2 weeks ago.
I think you gave short shrift to the rest that doesn't the lack of an evening on day 7.
Okay. You want
Just
to talk a little bit about what that means to you?
well, I think you have a picture of an eternal dwelling. Is what you have a picture of. I really do. Um, it's
You're
God
saying
dwelling. God,
that passage provides a picture of eternal dwelling.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
resting and dwelling with His people, and that there is no evening anymore. So it's an eternal thing.
Yeah, that refrain that we saw over and over in the poetic repetition of the first story is noticeable by being absent in day 7. And so the rain continues. Yeah, great point. And you're right, I did just slip that in the conclusion. We could have talked about that more. Okay, well, let's get into today's lesson. So if you will turn over to Genesis 2 and starting in verse 4, kind of give a little skim, or, this is probably not your first time reading this material. This is common material. It's oft mentioned and quoted. And so look through, we definitely have day 1 in our creation story 1 in our minds, right? We have the tone, the order, sort of the progression. So look at creation story number 2. How does it compare? What do you notice about tone or style, vibes?
Very lofty.
Okay,
It
which one?
feels well, these are the generations of the heavens, in verse 4. Um, I'm just getting this, what's the word I'm looking for? Words are hard these days. Um, Someone of position and power, like, is being spoken of. These are the generations of the heavens of the earth when they were created. In the day of the Lord, God
Okay.
made the
In the
earth
day.
and the heavens. It's
Yeah.
just it's being referenced differently, and it just seems more, on some note, a little King Jamesy.
Okay. Well, so I think many of our translations will have this as the account of when the heavens and earth were created. I love that yours has generations, because this is actually a formula. There
Mhm.
are 10 statements in Genesis. These are the generations of, and all the other ones are people. These are the generations of Noah. These are the generations of Shem. These are the generations of Ishmael. These are the generations of Esau. So it's an organizational device that parses the rest of Genesis out into 10 sections. And this is the only one that isn't a person. And yet it's
Mhm.
that same phrase. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. So that is a significant point about how Genesis is organized. What
In
else?
the,
What else y'all notice?
in the amplified version in verse 4 is this is a history. of heaven and earth.
Okay. Okay. So that is a fair way to translate that, but it misses the repetition, which I think is also significant. So yeah, so we're getting
Uh-huh.
both. Paige, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say that the first version is way more poetic and grand than the
The
second
first
one. The
creation
second
story.
one is very much there was this, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened.
Okay,
So not so
it's
much
much more
the
narrative.
morning and evening. This was the first day, and
Yeah.
as much poetic as the first one.
Yeah, so in that first one, we get that cosmic scale, the poetic language, the repetition. But in the second, we get a lot of direct contact. We get narrative. It is very narratively organized, right? It's more of a personal story, isn't it? Yeah. What else? What else do y'all notice?
God almost never speaks in the second story. In the first story, he speaks over and over again, let there be, let there be, let there be. In the second one, the only thing he first says is, it's not good for man to be on.
Yeah.
No.
So we have this focus on creation by speaking in the first story, right? Everything God does as a spoken command for it to come into being. And in the second story, what is God doing instead of speaking?
He
Like he's
causes it.
forming,
Right.
forming, he's breathing
Planting.
into
He's planting.
nostrils. It's much more earthy, right? In Tuesday's lesson, someone's like, it's almost like CPR when, and
That's funny.
it is, but you notice CPR instruction, a lot of the instruction has gone to compression only CPR because of the intimacy and risk of breathing into somebody's mouth, right? And so this is an intimate tone, right? There's one more change that's sort of interesting. I think our translations kind of obscure it. All of chapter 1, God has been Elohim. Um, God, it's the Hebrew plural of God, but it's used as a singular. It's just Elohim over and over again. Then, when we get to the second story, in verse 4, we have the Lord God, and the Lord is our special translation. You'll see your translations have it in all caps. That's our special way of putting the name of God, Yahweh. So it's Yahweh Elohim, and then after this, we have a lot of Yahweh. Yahweh is used over and over, starting in this second creation story. There's the personal name for God is used instead of just this Elohim order, and so there's so many differences here that this has been a question that people have asked, and it plays into the question of the authorship of Genesis. So let's do a little bit of authorship. And people have been asking for this authorship thing, but I didn't want to start with it because I feel like it's a little technical, and I wanted to get into that text right away, just get into the Bible verses right away when we started chapter 1. I didn't want to start with authorship. Hopefully it's not boring, but it is a little technical. So let's see what we can not spend all lesson on this, but I do want to do kind of a decently thorough job. Okay. Genesis. Look at the book itself. Who does Genesis claim as its author?
No one.
No one. Yeah. Genesis never says, I so and so wrote this book, or, here is the book written down by so and so. It doesn't give us an author. Does anyone know who the traditional author of Genesis is?
Moses.
Moses, yeah. Moses is taken as the traditional author. And so let's consider, why would we think about Moses? So Moses would be the traditional author of not just Genesis, but all 5 books of the Pentateuch. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Torah. So here's if you look on the website, if you happen to look at that, or if you want to go back and look, I have like 5 verses for you to look at that sort of unpack this, but let's look at a representative one. Turn to Deuteronomy 31, 24 through 36. Verse 24. It came about when Moses finished writing the words of this law in a book, and you remember book is really scroll, more literally translated scroll, finished the words of law in a book until they were complete. Moses commanded the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, saying, take this book of the law and place it beside the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, that it remain there as a witness against you. It's a law, right? It's going to tell them where they go wrong, which is what a law does, right? So we learn from that. What's Moses been doing? Been out, the Israelites have been wandering, and Moses, he's been writing his book. He's been writing down the words of the law. And this is, God commands Moses in Exodus 24:4. It's Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord, and then he gave them to, there's a one point where God says, I am going to punish the Amalekites for picking on you. Write that down. So Moses is a writer. We get that in the text itself. Also, Jewish and Christian tradition has referred to the Pentateuch as the books of Moses, all 5. We have sort of a reference to Moses's writing as early as Joshua. In Joshua 8:30-31, Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, in Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded the sons of Israel, as is written in the book of the law of Moses. So Moses has definitely been at least writing down the law. And then skip forward to the New Testament. Turn over to Mark 12:26. And if someone could read that for us, that would be great. This is a little argument that Jesus is having with the Pharisees, and he wraps it up with this. Paige, go ahead.
Now about the dead rising, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the account of the burning bush, how God said to him, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob?
Yeah. So burning bush in Exodus, Jesus refers to this passage and he calls it in the book of Moses. And really, Jesus referred to the whole Pentateuch, not just Exodus, as the book of Moses, the books of Moses, and said that Moses wrote about me. In John 5, Jesus says Moses wrote about me. So there's some content here that we're expecting. Okay, Moses is a writer. He writes this stuff. Now, Genesis, okay, so that quote was from Exodus. Moses was there at the burning bush, right? He was the guy. Let's think about Genesis. Was Moses alive during Genesis? No. He's born at the opening of Exodus. And we get the story of him, in a basket, adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, right? Genesis is before Moses' time. So Moses was not a witness to the events of Genesis. Some of the events of Genesis, no one was a witness to, right? And yet we know there had to have been an oral tradition among the Israelites because of that very quote that came from Mark. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. God says that. The people will recognize that. They have a tradition of their ancestors, of the patriarchs, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of Elohim, their being the God that they know as the God of Abraham. And so there is this oral tradition. Could Moses have been the one who compiled it? Maybe so. Who wrote it down? Maybe so. That is one idea of how these accounts came to be. Moses is a writer. Maybe Moses wrote it all. On the other hand, any ideas? What are some problems with Mosaic authorship? And the reason I want to bring this up is because I find that when we don't discuss these things in the church, they become little gotchas that someone who is either trying to disrupt faith or genuinely seeking the answers to these questions comes up with these problems. And then I'm like, well, nobody ever mentioned that to me. Why didn't I ever think about that? Why didn't we ever talk about it in the church? And I just don't want to be those people. I want to have thought about these things and talked about them. So, problems. What are the problems with Mosaic authorship? Any ideas?
There are some anachronisms, particularly in the names of cities, because they're names that are given after they come back into the land, into the promised land after the Exodus. So
Yeah.
after
Here's an example.
after Joshua conquests.
Yeah. Okay. So remember, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob's sons are the 12 tribes of Israel, right? Okay. Genesis 14:14. When Abram heard his relative had been taken captive, he called out his 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan, the name of the city Dan. But Dan is one of those 12 tribes of Israel. Abram, Isaac, Jacob, 12 tribes of Israel, Dan. Dan does not get its name until Judges 18:29. So it's well after Abraham, it's well after this writing, and it's well after the time of Moses. So why is that city named Dan? It would be named Dan if it were written down or edited by someone who was like, oh, well, nobody, before that, the city was named Laish, but nobody knows Laish anymore. I need to make sure this is named Dan so people know what we're talking about. There are several instances like that. There's times where it says, oh, well, at that time, Canaanites were in the land. You're like, well, the time of Moses, the entire time of Moses, Canaanites were in the land. You don't have to explain that. It's the current state. Explaining back then Canaanites were in the land is a later view. Does that make sense? Okay, good. I'm seeing nods. Okay. And if you want a little sampling of those besides the Dan one, you can find it on the study page. Here's a couple of other things Moses probably didn't write. Numbers 12:3. This is a little dust up between Miriam and Aaron. They're jealous of Moses and they're going to make a little fuss and say, we should get to be in charge too. And Moses, the text provides by way of explanation this parenthetical note. Now the man Moses was very humble, more than any man who was on the face of the earth. And then it explains how God dealt with Miriam and Aaron, and Moses didn't. So does the most humble man on the face of the earth write down in third person, now I was the most humble man on the face of the earth? It's just weird, right? It's kind of a funny one. Turn to the end of Deuteronomy to chapter 34. And will someone read for us 5 through 12? So this is the closing of the Pentateuch, the very last thing in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses. Does someone have that, verse 5?
I'll read it.
Go for it.
So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 20 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. What am I going through?
Through 12.
And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. And there is not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh, to all his servants, and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all of Israel.
Okay. So, what are there's more than one. What are the problems with Moses writing this passage?
Well, it's talking about him in past tense.
He died there. Yeah. It's
And
talking about it in past tense. Yeah. What else?
Well, there has not arisen a prophet like him before. That's a very backwards looking statement in general.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not just Moses is gone. It's like to this day, no one knows where his grave is. That sounds like that's generations later.
Yeah.
Since then, no prophet has risen. Generations. No one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. So it is this past looking view. And so we could believe that Moses wrote down the whole Torah. To do that, we would have to say that either Moses wrote it and then somebody appended this, which I think we're kind of getting there when we start talking that way, or like some have suggested, well, God dictated this passage to Moses and he wrote it down right before he died to say, I'm like, really? Well, how do y'all feel about that?
I mean, it's possible, but it doesn't sound plausible.
Yeah, go ahead, Paige.
I was going to say, Moses is like, nobody knows where I'm buried.
Right. Right.
Wait,
That's
what?
so funny.
Wait, can we workshop this a little bit before we commit it to the scroll?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's yes, okay, technically possible that God dictated this passage. Does God sometimes dictate word for word what God wants written down? I think so. Like the Ten Commandments sound dictated, don't it sounds like God, it was written with the finger of God, and then Moses broke the scrolls and the tablets, and then Moses had to write it again. That sounds dictated. But a lot of our inspired word of God is written by humans, and there's different voices. People sound different when they write. Like, it doesn't make sense to me that this is a pre-death dictated passage. And so a simple, flat, Moses wrote the Pentateuch, I don't think holds up to good logic based on the text itself. When we have reverence for the text, we need to respect how the text presents itself. And so here, this is clearly supposed to indicate a view from generations beyond Moses. And so I think it's only respectful of the material to recognize that. So that's why I don't like just a flat Moses wrote all of it. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, there is an academic view that I will attempt to describe without boring y'all to tears. So there is an academic theory called the documentary hypothesis that was developed in the 19th century. So we're talking like 1800s. This has been around for a while. And the idea is that scholars went through the text and they went, oh, these passages say Elohim and these passages say Yahweh. And I think an author would be consistent about that. So I bet those are different authors. And these passages really treat God as transcendent. And these passages really treat God as intimate and earthy. And so I think different authors would have those perspectives. And these sound like a prophetic view, and these sound like a priestly view. And so they have divided the text up into four different schools of source material called, they're named by letters, they're called J, E, D, and P, and some of those stand for, J and E stand for Yahweh and Elohim, and D and P stand for Deuteronomist and priestly. And it's like they take a highlighter, 4 different colors of highlighter, and highlight the whole thing and divide it up into the thing and then cut it up and then say, oh, all these were the J source, all these were the E source, all these were, and there's this idea that they were only combined much later. Okay. Is that possible? Well, I just said I thought there were some editing later, right? Somebody went in and said, let's call that city Dan instead of Laish. And somebody said, not to this day has there been a man like Moses. So, yes, I do think there's some editing. The problem with the documentary hypothesis, and so is also the good thing about the documentary hypothesis, which is it has provided material for papers for generations. Academics have been writing papers on this thing. They're still arguing about it to this day. And the thing is, we will never have an answer to that, if that's right or not, because all you're doing is you're using the material to say, oh, if there's tensions here, I think those are different authors. And what I think about the text is that God has provided us a complete text. And if there are tensions in it, then maybe they came from different authors, but God wanted them left in there. And we should look at those tensions and sit with those tensions and see, oh, do I really think God is immanent, that God is transcendent and therefore not intimate, immanent? Do I really think God is intimate and immanent and not transcendent? No, I think God is both of those things. And so when those tensions show up in the text and when those differences show up, I think those are some of the most interesting parts of the text for us. So regardless of the correctness, and they're still arguing, are there really 4 sources? Are there really maybe 3? The final form of the text is what the Spirit has provided us. And I think that's the most important thing. And so the way I view this, and I'd be interested if, like, say, Darren, if you have an opinion on this as well. The way I view this is that there was some core of the law that Moses definitely wrote down, and that formed an ancient source for this material. There must have been oral tradition just based on the way the story goes. And I think those 10, the generations of formula probably made that oral tradition easy to remember. And so helpful editors took these things and compiled them and gave us a final form. And at some point, the whole of the Old Testament was put in a final form that really, despite all the different authors, thematically, it hangs together. And so I think there were final editors who put that all together, put it in its final, I mean, there had to have been someone who put it in its final order, which would have been post-exile. So we can expect some core of contemporary writing, like Moses's writing, and then editors all the way up to the post-exilic era that gave us the gift of a beautifully integrated, complete Old Testament. Darren, you've studied this a little bit as well. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I think you described it pretty well. There's so many traits in the text that show that we have many hands that have gifted us with this text. There are, we didn't have the Hebrew language that we have now in. It was probably either oral initially or Proto-Semitic. It's been transcribed. There's defective spelling that didn't have vowels in it when it first came into being, and
Didn't
later
have vowels till 1000 AD. Isn't that
yes.
that's so late? It's amazing. Or like 800.
Well,
Yeah.
they had Vav and Yod earlier than that, but so you have defective spelling without any vowels. You have some that has these kind of partial start of a vowel, and you had no dot point, no dotting, no pointing system for the vowels that we read today, and it's just
Yep.
so
That's
much. And
what's
then
the
there's
800 to
words
1000.
there's words that are archaic and never used except in very old text and clearly very old sources in a lot of places. But then right next to it, there'll be something that's a very modern kind of not modern, but later Hebrew words. I mean, it's beautiful the way that we have what we have, and it's a treasure. But
Yeah.
if we get into an argument about who's author, it's inspired word of God, and let's stop. And we can find all kinds of treasure in that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautifully said. So I think, I'm bringing this up because I have seen people really flounder in finding out some of this information. Like, oh my gosh, this wasn't all written by Moses. I've been told it's written by Moses my whole life. What else is the church lying to me about? So, and I just don't want us to do that. And I don't want us to come and go like, well, if there's all these people messing with it, how can it be inspired? There was some, like, I came the first time this idea was presented to me, I was like, oh no, there was an inspired text, and then people edited it and messed it up, and we'll never get the original back. And that's not it. It takes time to work through this and go like, oh, God works through that process. God inspires our editors as much as our authors. And I don't really, in this kind of work, I'm not sure there's a hard line between an editor and an author. And so what we end up having is an Old Testament and even the Pentateuch that is finished quite late, but that doesn't make it less powerful. It gives it, you know how when we were doing the Deuteronomy through the Second Kings, we talked about how this is the prophetic view. This is the school of prophets are hearing God's view on history and conveying it through that history. We have kind of that same situation here in Genesis through Deuteronomy. Thoughts, questions? Okay, so we know our first authors and our first audiences span some time, but all ancient, right? And so that's why it makes sense that we have continued to look at like an ancient cosmology, an ancient sort of perspective as we look through this material. Let's get back. Let's do our verses 2 through 7 and see if we can get into the second story, just start into it in the time that we have left. Would someone read Genesis 2, 4 through 7?
I can do that.
Thanks.
The one that Judy read before. These are the generations of the
Yeah,
heavens.
start there. Yeah.
Okay. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground, and a mist was going up from the land and was watering the whole face of the ground. Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature.
Thank you. Okay, so we start out with the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. So that is an opening formula in all 10 places. So we know that this verse is an opening formula for the rest of the creation story. But there's something interesting here. This verse is also the closing piece of the first creation story. So, like how Judy noticed, like it's still poetic in this verse, in this first verse. I think that's what's going on here is this verse connects both of those stories because we have that repetition of heavens and earth, like we had it in 1:1. Like in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Here we have the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. And that word created is our bara. It's our special creation word that's only used of God. It's used 7 times in the first creation story, and this one is the 7th. So we can't ignore this verse as part of the creation story, the first creation story either, right? What I think is happening is it is connecting them intentionally. It is forming a hinge between first creation story and second creation story, because as we're going to see, they are really rather different, and yet they're also connected. Okay. So that's verse 4. Verse 5. If the first creation story pictured the uncreated world as the formless chaos waters, what does this story picture the uncreated world as?
It's a desert place.
It's right? What do
That's
we call a land with no plants and no rain, where no one lives? There's no Adam, no human.
yeah.
No one grows crops. That's a desert, right? And so this is obviously different than the first creation story. A chaos sea is not a desert. And yet they are similar, right? How are they similar?
Well, things had not been planted or sprung up. Like it was empty.
Emptiness.
Emptiness, right.
Yeah. Yeah, what else?
There was dust there, like when God created the earth, and he formed things from it.
Yeah.
So I don't know that maybe some of the elements, the picture of the elements are the same, but
Right. It's a picture that is not how we think of nothing. We think of nothing as the absence of matter, and yet it is a way of nothing, right? It's a wasteland. It's tohu and vohu. It's wild, wild and waste, void and empty. Those words that mean a wasteland. And so there's this parallel. And you notice that in our first creation story, what was the pinnacle item of the created things?
man.
Humans, right? Mankind, male and female in the image of God. Here, that says there is no Adam. So there's nothing yet until there's humans. And so there is this idea that creation hasn't been done until mankind is created. All right. So what are we going to these things are different, right? Can we just take this creation story and slot it into day 6? Does that make sense? Is this like or could we have a whole video and this video just fits on day 6? No, because there's no shrub.
Right. No shrub.
Right? The vegetation was done on day 3, and this says there is no vegetation, and we go ahead and make mankind. And so it's a different order. These are a different view of the story. It's not going to match up. We won't be able to say, oh, well, this belongs on this day. And that's okay. It's the same story told in a different style. What happens in verses 6 and 7 to change the wasteland?
But streams from the earth came up and watered the whole surface of the ground, and the Lord formed man from the dust.
Yeah, okay. So this mist or stream rises from the earth because remember the ancient cosmology, there's water above the dome, there's water below the land, right? So God allows a tiny trickle, right? A mist, a small amount, a controlled amount rises up. And what do you have when you mix dust and water?
Clay.
Yeah, mud, clay. And so God forms the man from this resulting dust and water, like a potter forming clay. And we have an Hebrew wordplay here. The Adam, the human, is formed from the Adamah, the ground. They're related words. We are made of the dust, right? The human, the Adam from the Adamah, and they're both from the root word that means red, right? Humans are earthy. We are from the red soil. We are made of red stuff. So the Adam from the Adamah. And how does God animate the human he has formed?
He breathes into his nostrils the breath of life.
Yeah, that very intimate. Like, you need a CPR mask to be doing that stuff. You need to be protected. But God breathes into the human's nostrils. So, how does that feel to us?
Very intimate. I don't know. I also think of when I read this, every time I see the word breath, I think of the Spirit.
Yeah. I had thought, I went and looked through the words here. I had thought this would be Ruach. As the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, that word Ruach, that means spirit, wind, or breath, but it is not.
Oh,
It is a different word. And this God breathed into man the breath of life. Both of those are related words to each other, but they're different from Ruach. And I think, nevertheless, we have that thematic connection to the breath of God. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? And then what do we become?
Living creature.
Living creature. Any other translations?
Mine says living being.
Living being, living creature. These are the exact same words in chapter 1 for what the animals became living creatures or living souls. So we're nefesh hayah, we are the same things. We talked about how the animals become nefesh hayah, a living soul or a living creature, and the human becomes same words. And it irritates me when translations use different words in chapter 2 than in chapter 1, because the continuity is really there. It's the same words. We are those same living souls, those same living creatures. What does that mean to us? What do you take from that?
Well, Paul quotes this verse to prove that this is the natural man, not the spiritual man.
Okay.
And so
I,
he
I kind of think he's doing a thing,
he's doing a
but
thing.
yeah.
He's doing a thing. I think he's very literal. He quotes this verse explicitly and says, "See, that's the
Yes,
natural man."
he
Uh,
does.
and in Genesis 1, I think he contrasts the last Adam, which is the Genesis 1 Adam, to the Genesis 2 Adam, the first Adam.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
he kind of turns it upside down from what we've grown up hearing it.
Okay, and maybe that's what I'm kind of doing. A thing is a little bit, it's vague, and I couldn't possibly make a coherent argument on the spot. But there's a
Hey,
so
coffee
there
later.
is a continuity with the animals and us, right? We are mammals. When you list out the characteristics of mammals, we are in it. You know, there is a continuity between us and animals. We're one of them. And so I think maybe that's where Paul is getting that natural man idea. But then also we have the breath of God bringing us to life, bringing us into that life. And I think that is maybe the element that is continuous with God's intent to create us in the image of God. And so we are both one of the animals and also in the image of God, a creature that is both. What do y'all think? Any thoughts on that?
And I was looking at this. The word I was looking at in the New Amplified Version. It says, "Then the Lord formed man out of dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils or spirit of life and become a living being." And they give a reference to 1 Corinthians 15:45 through 49, and which says, So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam is a living spirit. The spiritual did not come first, but the natural after the spiritual. But the first man was of dust of man, so that those who are on earth, as a man from born of likeness of the earth, earthly man, shall we bear the likeness of men from heaven?
Yeah. This is the verse that Darren refers to. The first man, Adam, became a living soul, a living creature. And the last Adam, by that he means Jesus. Jesus is the recreation of Adam. Just as Jesus is the new Moses and Jesus is
Right.
the new David, Jesus is also the new Adam, right? Became a life-giving spirit, although became is inserted there. The first man became a living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. And so that idea that humans are created in the image of God, and yet there is a promise coming that we will be more once the work of Jesus Christ is complete. And so there is that promise already as we look back with our New Testament eyes. We see that in the text here. Yeah, and Paul definitely saw that. Great point. Great point. What else? What happened to the God who was speaking creation into being? Why is God now doing pottery and CPR? And what's going on with God here?
He's interacting. He's hands-on. He's not just speaking.
Yeah.
He's like involved in it. It is showing. The other one feels more distant, like he's speaking it from somewhere else. This is like his presence is right here with us.
Yeah. And so I would say this is not because these are different authors. It's because our God is both the cosmic king of the universe and our personal potter and breath of life and the one who reaches out and touches us. You know, in the creation all the way through to God's Spirit through Jesus Christ who indwells us. There is both the transcendent person of God and the immanent, the within us, intimate person of God, both real elements of who God is. So we can tell our second creation story is just going to be different, right? It begins with a world that is similarly formless and empty, but it's the desert wasteland instead of the dark chaos sea. It's less ordered poetry and more earthy intimacy. And so that's what we are going to be looking for in this second story. And it may be that the first is a painting done in like a cosmic view and a photorealism, and the other is the impressionist painting, right? Different views through these artful creation stories. And so we could look at the differences and say, oh, let's think about who different people who authored them. But I think that what we're meant to do here is look at how the characteristics of our God are so rich and faceted and varied, and what a blessing they are to us. And we have a complete text inspired, and we have the ideas in the text that when they contrast, they give us even more richness. You know, just as God is both a God of justice and mercy, we also have these different portraits of God and what it means to be human here. And so while we are the rulers over the living creatures, we also are living creatures. We have been spoken into being in the image of God, but we have also been formed from the red earth like a potter forming clay. And so each of these is true to who we are, and we're going to be watching for all of that as we continue in this second creation story. It is April, and so we have a regular month, no spring breaks, no holidays. We just have our 3 lessons in April and then service day. So we will be meeting again next week for lesson 8, Sacred Space and the Garden Temple, from Genesis 2, 8 through 17. Any final comments before we go to prayer time?
I love to point out that, the first is cosmic view. This is kind of earth to heaven view. And you see that in 2:4, the chiasm that's there, you have,
It flips the order as it repeats.
yeah,
Yes.
reverse the order. It says, these are the generations of heaven and earth when they were created, the Lord God, and then it says made earth and heaven. So they reverse upside down in that little beautiful verse of it's a picture of what we're seeing, a transition. So
Yeah.
it's,
Little hinge.
yeah.
I do love that as well. Yeah. Great point. What else? Anything else? Okay. Well, let's go to our prayer time. I really appreciate all of your participation today. It made like this. I was worried this lesson is a little dry, but I wasn't bored, so I thought it was interesting. I hope it came out that way because of your good comments. Thank you.